thank you for the organization and for inviting me. This talk is called Only Pragmatically Driven International Change. Let's start with a brief introduction on international languages, which use the fundamental frequency to convey what are called post-lexical meanings. So the international sign can be thought of as a part of a surface form signifier, which is made of the international contour and its smaller units, which matter to pragmatics, which are usually the pitch accent and boundary tone, and post-lexical meaning or signified, which is made up of modality, possibly submodality, and other epistemic biases, pragmatic nuances, focus, and so on. So we have examples of the shapes of the surface form, which makes a signifier in the suprasegmental sign, and the signifiers are classified usually into sentence types, like counter-expectational WH question, exhortative sentence, imperative yes-no question, and so on. Okay. Usually, the signified, like in standard phonology, is considered a universal layer, whereas the signifier is the one which varies according to the language and which is associated to it conventionally. So that's why we fix one by one the sentence types and we study them. And we study the contours associated to them, especially in studies on international change. But those studies usually document only the sentence types they want to analyze. And this, I think, is a slight limitation in considering in having all the data about the systems in assessing the causes for phenomena, for variation, and for change. Okay. Usually those studies on international change under the apparent time hypothesis compare age groups simply and see in their asymmetry, the evolution of a behavior, of an international system. But as change leaves behind variation, we can also study change by looking at variation in a synchronic documentation, when it is clear which the direction of the change is and which contours are associated to the substratum, which is supposedly disappearing, and which ones are associated to the standard language in a situation of standardization, for instance. Those contact situations are usually the contact between two groups, each one associated with a language or a linguistic heritage, a language or a variety, or a type of accent, say. But there are also situations like in Italy, which is the situation I'm going to present today, in which the standard language arrives as a written language or arrives through the television without a physical displacement of a human group towards the location. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the eastern city of Pescara, eastern Italian city of Pescara. And what happens in Pescara? We have bi-intonationalism, as I call it. We have a substratum Romance language which is disappearing, and the standard language, which is Italian, which have been in contact for many years, so that when looking at the international system, most sentence types have the substratum transferred contour, which is called conservative contour, and a few sentence types show both a substratum transferred contour, which is conservative, and another one which is not present in the Romance substratum language, which I call innovative. Sometimes it is a contour which we find in Rome. Sometimes it is an exotic solution. It is a non-standard perception of what standard should be, so to say. But speakers do not polarize into conservative speakers and innovative speakers. They all can use both types of contours, and innovative patterns are tending to prevail in time, over time. So when I interact with someone in Pescara, I'm aware that they have both they master both the conservative and the innovative contours, okay? And so do I. Some recent hypotheses have placed the contact and its implications more in the real life interaction than in the mind of the bilingual speaker, which means that what is relevant is the real contact between varieties of the same language and not abstract contact between languages in the language in which the interaction occurs. Also, the accommodation theory has recently seen language change as the outcome of the daily interaction, face-to-face interaction, okay? So that the convergence in the sense of accommodation entails a phonetic convergence of the signifiers, but a systemic phonetic convergence, because phonetic may, not only phonetic, in the language, in the long, at the systemic level. Okay, so the two forms which are present in the system becoming more and more similar to one another. Also, we import some notions from standard language change theory at the segmental level, like the notion of mixed lex and fudged lex, which in interlanguage situations and multiple inventory situations correspond to systems where the form from both donor languages are present only, and fudge legs are forms where besides them you also have forms which are intermediate and present the characteristics of both forms of the donor language at the same time. Also, there is some speculation that, it's a reasonable speculation that change below the level of conscious awareness can go along with gradual change. And in intonation, gradual change is not only in the percentages of use of variants, but also in the parameters, in the phonetic form. So in frequency or in the alignment, which is our case. 3 studies on polar questions have found that polar questions are particularly prone to convergence to the non-native variant. The first one is the study by O'Rourke on L1 Quechua speakers of L2 Spanish, which have transferred their original conservative contour for declaratives, but have converged to the L2 to the standard Spanish contour for interrogative sentences. Also, the studies were already mentioned by Romero and Ordiera on Catalan dominant and Spanish dominant bilinguals of Mallorca show that their contours for questions converge to one another, whereas their contours for statements remain more close to their original shape in the monolingual, which can be observed by the monolingual. And also a study on Andalusian Spanish, people living in Asturias find that they accommodate more in questions to the local pattern, to the local Spanish pattern, than in statements. And this really monitors accommodation live, because they put the interviewers being local speakers to accommodate too. But all these studies show that the questions are more prone to converge to non-native contours, but unfortunately, the signifier and the signified are different. So the authors, of course, attribute the asymmetry in the behavior to the phonetic form, to the difference in the signifiers. They say the contour of the questions is more salient, and this is why there is more convergence, something like that. So our question is, what if questions be more prone to convergence because they are questions, simply because they are questions, that is, because of their pragmatic value as questions? But it is impossible to design an experiment in which the intonational signs of questions and of another sentence type to compare them to show the same signifiers but different evolutions. So we must find these situations in nature through documentation. But we were lucky because in Pescara, both neutral information-seeking polar questions and contrastive focus statements exhibit the same range, the same variation of pitch accents. And we also have documented 2 age groups in this variety of Italian. It was not designed for that. It was a full documentation of 35 sentence types through the discourse completion task on 2 age groups. And we extracted just the data reference to those 2 sentence types. And in total, we analyzed 76 tokens. And we found that 2 main pitch accents are used for the questions, and the same are used for the contrastive focus statements. We're showing on the left-hand side, we have what we call a pre-tonic peak, which is a conservative accent. On the right-hand side, an innovative. We don't enter into the discussion of phonological labeling, because it's like saying whether a Canadian bilingual French-English speaker has 2 different acoustic images in the word pause said in French and the word pause said in English. It's more or less this kind of thing we are analyzing. They're very similar and they represent the same meaning, okay? But in 2 different intonations. One is talking with an accent, another is talking without an accent. And we want to see whether they neutralize. So we also have intermediate patterns, like the double peak. On the left-hand side, we have pretonic and tonic peak. We have 2 humps, and they may be joined by a plateau, like on the right-hand side. But also, this contour is the one we want to look at more closely. And this is a midway peak, okay? So the peak is exactly at the boundary between the tonic onset and the tonic nucleus when it starts giving, it's in between giving the impression of a pretonic rise and a tonic rise, okay? So for the contrastive focal contours, we get the exact same thing, but with different numbers. We're going to show it, pretonic peak, tonic peak on the right, double hump, double peak on the left, plateau on the right, and midway peak. Curiously, we just have 1 occurrence of the midway peak in this situation for contrastives. Let's look at numbers. So letter D is the midway peak. And you can see that the midway peak is getting the more popular strategy by the youngsters, but only when it is used for yes-no questions. So when you look at this scatter plot, we have put on the x-axis the first peak, and on the y-axis the second peak, okay? And their alignment with respect to this boundary between onset and nucleus of the tonic syllable, of the stress syllable. So that on the diagonal will be all the contours which only have 1 peak, okay? Be it on the left or on the right. So in green, you see the contrastive focus. You have clearly conservative strategies and clearly innovative strategies, and some double peak, which are the blue spots. But when you go to the yes-no questions, you see that the same thing happens by the old speakers, but the young speakers have aligned a lot, not to say all of them, their contours into only one peak, okay? So the 2 peaks have converged in the system into a midway peak. And this happens only for the questions. So there is an asymmetry in this distribution and the evolution of accents, which are the same accents, okay? But they evolve differently according to whether they're used for contrastive statements or questions. For contrastive statements, the pretonic and tonic peak are preserved and maintained well distinct, whereas for yes-no questions, the one intermediate peak accent becomes the prevailing the strategy by the young people. So the midway strategy is a result of a gradual convergence of a continuous parameter, which is the peak alignment, and it is favored by the variable sentence type yes, no question over contrastive statement. And this asymmetry cannot be ascribed to the surface form of the contours because they were identical. Okay. Also, there is no reasonable reason to ascribe it to the distinct boundary tone because we have knowledge of phenomena of tonal repulsion, but not of tonal harmony so far. At least I don't have this knowledge. And also because we tested two different number of post-tonic syllables, and it is not sensitive to it. Our data are not sensitive to it. And so it is reasonable to think that the pragmatics of the information question make the speaker in a subordinate role because they need information. And so, according to the accommodation study by Gazariak et al., there are more subject to phonetic convergence with plausible long-term effect. Finally, information seeking yes, no questions are more prone to phonetic convergence than contrastive statement in Pescara Italian. The study suggests that this is because of a universal property of its pragmatics, and we recommend that more documentations of full intonational systems be made in order to run into these coincidences, this kind of situations. Thank you very much. You have my email address on the right.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. Any questions?
Yes. Uh, do you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, please.
kind of low. I cannot see you, but this is because I have
Mohammed?
my.
Yes, Marco, thank you very much for this interesting talk.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Um, Brilliant. Now, just a question now about the approach that you used in labeling. I mean, when you use the H star and low star, these label sets, which approach did you follow in these labelings? Do you follow Per Humpert's, Toby, or the IBRA system, which is the uh, by Hualde and Brito? So which one did you use? This is the first question. The second one, which is related to the same point, it is you said phonetic convergence. It might be like it's technical term, but could you explain it more? Because readers would appreciate if you explain what you mean by this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. I used Toby. I used the Toby labeling system, but I did not show labelings because what happens is that there is a change, an ongoing change, which is phonetic clearly, and we wonder whether neutralizing two accent associated to two different heritages, but which used to be distinct. It's like the Canadian speaker, which I mentioned. A Canadian speaker has the word pause in English and has the word pause in French. Are they different acoustic images? So if he neutralizes it, is that a phonological change or is it a phonetic change? Should I use two different labels? So the label I used for these contours were L plus H star in parentheses because it refers to a prenuclear accent which spreads until the nucleus and leaves a trace which is relevant to pragmatics in Pescara, and H star plus L as a nuclear accent, and depending on for questions you have LH as a boundary tone, and for contrastive you have L as a boundary tone. So, but I only use Toby, but I slightly modified because I added this parameter of the pretonic rise, which is makes whether you're talking with an accent or not with an accent, but becomes relevant to pragmatics in Pescara
So
somehow.
it's worth pointing out this, I think, in the paper, in
Well,
the final version, I mean.
okay, I didn't want to mention it too much because the variable that I observe is phonetic, but the trigger, the independent variable, is a phonological difference, is a pragmatic difference. Okay, but I'm happy with observing a phonetic change, let's say, because it would complicate too much, asking whether this should be labeled differently, they should stop being labeled differently, okay, should be labeled differently only for the contrastive focus and only for the old people for the sentence, for the questions, you know. But okay, I will consider that. About your second question, Sarah Tomlinson talks, I think she defines phonetic convergence. Laura Colantoni and Gurlakian also in their paper take this definition of phonetic convergence, which means that two phonetic forms in the system, like not in one utterance, but in the system, when used systematically to refer to meanings, become more and more similar to one another in time. So this is my definition of phonetic convergence. Two forms associated to the possibly to the same meaning become more and more similar to one another in time.
Okay. Professor Botinis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marco. It was excellent to listen to this presentation.
Thank you,
And
Professor Martin.
well, I'd like to ask, I assume that in many languages, including Italian, when you have a statement, every lexical word has a stress correlated with a tonal change, more or less, unless sometimes it is suppressed. Well, I saw here a lot of double peak tonal contours. And as I understood, the first peak is quite early and the second peak is more or less in the middle. Well, okay for the first peak, but the second peak, why appears there? And if it has variable forms, I mean to say, if you had another material, would it be more to the right? Is it something like focus or sentence type or maybe rhythm? My question, the second peak, is it in a stable position, in a variable position? And with which function could it be associated? Thank you.
Okay. I wish I had shown you an audio, but I haven't prepared it because there would be no time. So the double peak is found in a few examples here. You have 5 in the contrastive focus and just 1 for the questions. But it's like the way I perceive it. It is the speaker is hesitating about whether to use the first or the second strategy, and thinks this is more by older speakers. No, this is more okay. Whatever. I remember one example for the older speakers. He's renegotiating, sort of. It's like a phase of destabilization of the system, where he doesn't know which intonation to use. This is my impression. and he ends up using both. There usually is a certain distance, but it does not go fully inside the syllable as this one, for instance, the tonic peak, or the tonic peak here, for instance. And you also can have the pretonic peak slightly higher or slightly lower. Originally, in the dialect, in the substratum language, I'm sorry I can't show you, but you had an obliquous bump. So you had a pretonic peak, and then you had a tonic slow fall, which sort of braked, stopped falling somehow, and made a bump, made like a hump, sorry, and an obliquous bump, and then kept on falling. So it was the resistance, the tonic resistance of a high peak. This happened on questions because we had a syntactic trigger for questions which has disappeared in Italian. So the reasons for the change of what happens on the right are very complex. There are people who still speak Italian by using the che word, which is a polar marker. Like, is it that? But it is not grammatical in Italian, but they still use it in regional Italian. And other which have it in mind and know that they have to put the high boundary tone, not to let the sentence be ambiguous, but still make unconsciously this obliquous bump on the tonic syllable. And yes, it cannot go, in the examples I have found, much into the tonic syllable, but it is still tonic in the measure, in the sense that it is well distinguished from the pretonic. So the impression is clear to the ear. I can hear both contours, both peaks. You know, I can hear an overlapping.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I wish we had the conference in person and meet here and continue our discussion over coffee, right?
Whenever you feel like. Thank you very much, Professor.
Unfortunately, we have to do our best. And okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you indeed.